I will be analyzing the poem Daddy, which belongs to Sylvia Plath's poetry book called Ariel. It is comprised of 12 poems that are thought to narrate her life and belongs to a movement called confessional poetry, which adds real as well as fictitious events to portray her feelings. All of the poems shift settings. Some have specific physical places, while others are just mere descriptions in Sylvia's mind, metaphorical representations. The whole book contains poems that are written in first, second, and third person narration. The specific passage that I will be analyzing is Daddy, and it is comprised of 16 5-line stanzas. It is thought to be a confessional about her father, Otto Plath. The narrator is Sylvia, since she is talking about her father, and it is both first and second person narration since there is a you and an I throughout the poem. An important thing to mention is that because of an illness that her father suffered, diabetes, he had to have a leg amputated, and that is where the empty black boot representation comes from. The poem Daddy was written on October 12, 1962 after the death of her father, Otto Plath, and after her husband, Ted Hughes, left her in poverty when he cheated on her with another woman. The setting starts in her mind inside a black shoe where she lives, but actually is a metaphor for her father and her life with him. There is also a description of the U.S. mentioned in San Francisco and its large seals, as well as Massachusetts. We then move to Poland, which is supposedly her father's birthplace from where he emigrated. We then move to Germany in the time of World War I, and then she describes what she sees through the window in a train, which are the mountains of Tyrol, Austria, and Italy. And then she describes her father as Hitler, using war imagery including air forces, tanks, and sinister pictures. There is a description of her father in his classroom, where the poem suddenly jumps to a dark place where there are descriptions of devils and vampires and mythical creatures. At the end of the poem, there is a representation of a village, which is also a mystical village where the celebration of a death and of a vampire takes place. The setting of the poem jumps from the US to Germany to World War I and finally to a mythical time when villagers believed in vampires. The atmosphere of the poem is extremely creepy, sinister, and has direct and violent imagery of war, Hitler, and demons. There is absolutely nothing positive about it. The main characters in this passage are the objectified representation of Otto Plath and Sylvia Plath with an indirect link to Ted Hughes, which was Sylvia's ex-husband. This poem talks about all the suffering that Sylvia had to endure in her childhood while living with a German father that had no emotions whatsoever. The repression of feelings caused her to see him as a god that had to be respected, but yet was not a fatherly figure. When he died at the time she was 8, she was left without a god and was used to living in a repressed environment with a lack of love. In reality, he died when she was 8, but in the poem she mentions that it was when she was 10 years old. Then, when she was 20, she tried to join him in death, but then realized the confinement she had been living in due to this masculine image in her life. She tries to get rid of him, what she represents to him, until she says, "Daddy, daddy, you bastard, I'm through." This confessional poem, however, is unable to save her since she commits suicide shortly after she finishes it. Overall, the sinister, evil feeling to the poem helps represent the suffering that Sylvia had to go through while living with this emotionless individual. It also allows the theme to be represented accurately. It represents how a patriarchal society can lead to the continual confinement and repression of women, which may lead to a severe emotional baggage. The war imagery allows the father, Otto, to be accurately represented as a German man, very strict, oppressive, and with no emotions. The mythical imagery then allows the memory of her father to be represented as partly a devil and a vampire in Sylvia's life, sucking all the energy and love out of her. Throughout the use of figurative language, symbolism, and juxtaposition, the author effectively conveys the feelings of oppression and violence found in a patriarchal society which are recurrent in her life. My main idea, or the claim, was the first one was figurative language, which included metaphor and similes, and my first evidence was, if I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year, 7 years if you want to know, found in lines 72 to 74, and here Sylvia is referring to Ted Hughes, her husband, as a vampire. It sounds simply like a mean metaphor. However, when she mentions 7 years, she is actually describing the length of her marriage and how her husband sucked her blood or her life for 7 years. When she says, I've killed one man, if I've killed one man, I've killed two, she also relates the vampire to her father due to the fact that he also caused her a lot of suffering in her life. My second evidence is not God but a swastika in line 41. And here the swastika is a symbol of Nazism. And Nazism was a fascist political regime, and fascism is an authoritarian restrictive form of government that is generally associated with dictators such as Hitler. So this relates back to the theme of oppression and restriction, since Sylvia characterized her father as a pro-Nazi, and that was portrayed through Nazism. Finally, another evidence I found was I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look, in lines 54 to 55. And the Mein Kampf was an autobiographical book about Hitler and his life, which again relates to the theme of oppression and fascism towards her, and how she relates her father to the dictator that Hitler was. My main idea or claim number 2 was symbolism, and the first evidence that I found was marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one great toe, found in lines 8 and 9. This excerpt represents her father as something huge. She symbolizes her father with a ghastly, creepy statue, and the use of marble heavy can be used to represent the coldness and bitterness of her father, but somehow she still looks up to him as a huge statue. It's so huge, even after she's dead, that he represents a huge part of her life, and the memories don't even let her live in peace. The second evidence I found was a cleft in your chin instead of your foot, but no less a devil for that, found in line 48 and 49. This is a really straightforward use of symbolism. Demons, or devils, are usually represented as half goat and half human. This means that the devil's foot are usually like goat's feet, which are cleft in the middle. Autoplath had a cleft chin, and she used that characteristic to compare it to a devil, saying he was no less devil for having the cleft in the wrong place. Another evidence I found was I never could talk to you, the tongue stuck in my jaw, found in lines 24 to 25. This use of symbolism directly tells the reader that Sylvia Plath could not speak to her father, and she had a very bad communication with him. By saying that her tongue gets stuck in her jaw, she is using a sort of metaphor for being physically unable to talk. A symbolism to the fact that she felt too oppressed and confined by her father that she literally felt as though she couldn't speak. My main idea or claim number 3 was juxtaposition, and the first evidence I found was any more black shoe in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, in lines 2 to 4. And this black shoe symbolizes her life with her father and how she doesn't actually live in a shoe, but feels that way due to the memories of oppression of her father and feels trapped. The juxtaposition with black and white is used to compare good and evil as well, and poor and white represents both her purity as a child with white and how she was a victim of oppression in comparison with her father's black evil shoe. In my second evidence, brute heart of a brute like you stand at the blackboard daddy in lines 50 to 51, and here the juxtaposition of the word daddy appears again. However, it is now contrasted with the word brute, which is defined as a savagely violent person. Therefore, she is comparing a savagely violent person to her daddy, teaching in front of a blackboard. It is a contrast again between good and evil. My final evidence was, Daddy, daddy, you bastard, I'm through, in lines 80, which was the last line of the poem. And daddy is a word used to refer to a fatherly figure with affection and love. However, here he juxtaposes the word daddy with bastard, which is the definition of an unpleasant and despicable person. This shows how she is simply referring to Otto as daddy in a sarcastic way, when in reality she hates him. So, in conclusion, this poem is part of the confessional movement and is talking about herself and her experience living with her father, meaning Sylvia. And she uses different war and mythical symbolism to convey her feelings of hate and her perspectives towards her father. All the poem relates back to the theme, which is how a patriarchal society, meaning a society in which males hold primary power in terms of political leadership, social privileges, and family matters, including women and children, may eventually lead to the oppression and confinement of women. In this case, how Otto Plath Sylvia's father, which was a pro-Nazi, and Ted Hughes, Sylvia's husband, that was very much alike to her father, caused her to live in a confined and repressed life based off of violence, hate, and suffering.